this was probably much later than 1607. But they still had cannon that they took off the ship. It would have been smaller than this. But you can imagine that when they confronted the Indians. And they also had muskets. And you look at the armor. I mean, if you obviously can be killed with an arrow, but you can imagine if an Indian shoots an arrow and it bounces off your chest. So technology again trumps what old-fashioned things, and that led to the defeat of the Indians. When the Pilgrims came, the next settlement I think was at about 1623 in Massachusetts. That was primarily religious. That was not economic. The Pilgrims in Massachusetts, they were the first ones because they were actually they lived in Holland for a while because they couldn't get the religious freedom that they wanted in England, so they went next to Holland in Amsterdam, I believe. And then finally they left Amsterdam to come to America where they could have religious freedom. But it was their religious freedom. So even in the early settlements, when they had religious freedom, it was my religion, my freedom, and if you come here, you're going to practice this religion. So even though there was religious freedom, it was religious freedom that they practiced. You had to belong to the church. They were required, even in Jamestown, they had to go to church. If they didn't go to church, there were penalties that were involved in that. So that was a very important part of the psyche of the people that settled here. Whether you wanted to be religious or not, you were going to be religious, or at least you were going to be in church. Jamestown was a corporation where people invested in it and they expected a return on their money. And that was the tobacco, and they were looking for other things. Glass, they tried glass. That didn't really pan out. But they thought when they came here that they were going to find gold and be instantly rich. And obviously that didn't happen. They did tar and pitch and pine for ship masts and things like that, but the most valuable export out of Virginia ended up being tobacco. And that started the whole slavery thing from 1619, wasn't even resolved until the middle of the 1900s. And America fought the Civil War, where slavery was a large part of the cause of it. But in 1619, they picked up, 4 or 5 slaves when they stopped in Jamaica or somewhere in the islands of the Caribbean. Okay, then they came up here. Now, initially, they were going to be indentured servants, where you work for 6 to 8 years, and then after that, you're let free. Think about how labor-intensive this settlement was. So there was a demand for these guys. So later on, they gave up the indentured servant part of it and just used them as slaves. And tobacco is labor intensive. You need people out there in the field. So if you can buy a slave, you know, that's the best machine you got in the whole wide world. And then cotton, later on, as it developed in America, that's humongously labor intensive. So that's the whole basis for slavery was economic. If I own a slave and they're a source of income for me, for the most part, I don't want to beat them and hurt them. I want them to be strong and work hard. So a lot of the stories sometimes of slavery are overdone in terms of beatings. Now, obviously, slavery is an evil thing, but it became politicized remember, slavery was a southern institution in New England and northern states, they didn't have slavery because they weren't farming. They were a mechanized economy. So when you get farming, which is labor intensive, the desire for slaves was much stronger in the South. In the North, there just was no virtual need. There was no demand for slaves there. Slavery would have ended of its own accord because technology would have made slavery obsolete. Because it's cheaper to have a machine than it is to pay for the upkeep of a human being. It's just that simple. But technology had just, in the 1860s, if they'd have waited 20 more years, slavery probably would have gone out of business because it was economically too expensive to keep people when you could use machines. The Indians were just overcome by technology and advances. I mean, a lot of people say, well, we should leave it for the Indians. Well, would we still be living in wigwams and teepees? I mean, So I get a kick out of it because in American history, a lot of times they'll say how mean we were to the Indians. Well, yes. But that's the story of humanity over the years. New hordes of people, new ideas, they just overtake the old. That's what happens.